And welcome everyone. Good evening. And this is the second session of Holy of Holies, readings in Shir Ha-shirim and its reception, where we have the pleasure of learning again this week with Miriam Gedwiser. Shir Ha-shirim can be both confusing and sublime. What is this series of love poems doing in Tanakh? Assuming that it has some non-surface meaning, what is it and how can we access it? And in this course, we will read selected passages from Song of Songs with midrashic, medieval, and later commentators to get a taste of possible answers to these questions and more. It's always a pleasure to be learning with Miriam Gedwiser. She is a teacher at the Talmud faculty of SAR, as well as a longtime faculty on Drisha. So it's great when we can have her.
Great. So thanks for being here. And thank you, Kayla, for the introduction and facilitation. Always excellent. And yeah, so today maybe a little bit of leaning into the and later commentators part of the reception of Shir Ha-shirim. I think I tried to pick something that has, well, I'm going to be reading, among other things, there's like a sort of a dramatic scene in chapter 5 where the the male lover shows up at the door and he knocks and the woman doesn't answer the door. We'll read it together in a second. Um, and it's one of the moments that seems to have more of what we is familiar to us maybe as like a narrative structure and tension, right? It's sort of like it has like a plot, I guess is what I'm saying. Not all of Shir Ha-shirim has a plot. Some of Shir Ha-shirim is like, you're so beautiful, I have a sister, there are little foxes, like a lot of metaphorical language, but not necessarily like events that seem to be occurring in sequence, which is even in these like six psukim, we're going to see events that happen in sequence, and we're going to see different ways that they've been interpreted. So in some ways, because it's like an event and it gives like a lot, it's sort of it gives a decent insight into the inner world of the two characters. And actually at the end also our additional characters show up, who I think I mentioned last time, right? The daughters of Jerusalem are going to be there. So they're going to be somebody else, usually interpreted as the nations of the world. So we're gonna sort of see how these characters all play together, and it works as an allegory or a metaphor, but the sometimes, okay, when you say like your eyes are like doves, and then it's like, oh, because doves XYZ, that allegory or metaphor doesn't have, it's not the same as a story that has its own life, that brings up its own emotional associations that then you also want to say is something about Israel and God. So that's kind of where we're headed, and maybe I'll share the source sheet and we'll just begin to read the passage from Shir Ha-shirim. And here we are. This is, I believe, what you have. So here we are. Okay, so I first want to just read this story. It starts in verse 2 of chapter 5, which is an interesting thing, whether just sort of a long article about the way that the chapters came about and why they're like this. But so like yeah, whether verse 1 doesn't seem to really be part of this story. Verse 1 is a continuation of the sort of the garden stuff that we talked a little bit about last time. Chapter 4 is all about, right, like in the end he says, like the male lover is describing the woman in these flowery terms. He says she's a locked garden, and then in the beginning of chapter 5 she says, come to my garden. Okay. uh, so after that moment, which seems like the moment that they are going to be reunited or united for the first time, we have this passage, Ani Yeshena V'li Bi Er. And there are songs about this. Maybe next week we'll do songs from Shir Ha-shirim, and whether that's even allowed. Okay. Ani Yeshena V'li Bi Er. I am asleep, but my heart is awake. And at each stage, we can think about what's going on again in the pshat story and in the potential allegory. So, for example, what does it mean that my heart is awake? If this is an analogy, either for a religious person, or for the Jewish people. Kol dodi dofek. So that's translated here as hark, my beloved knocks. We often think of, many of us we hear kol dodi dofek, right? The voice of my beloved is knocking. I think the translations often translate it this way. And some of the midrashim read it that way, also kol as voice. But it seems like kol might be an interjection, right? Kol, hark. That's why it's translated as hark, right? Dodi dofek. My beloved is knocking. Pitchili achoti rayati yonati tamati, right? Open up, my sister, my beloved, my dove, my pure one, right? my fault list of, they translate. And there's midrashim, which we're not going to see about why those four things and what do they all mean. Okay. Shiroshini mlatal, because my head is drenched with dew. Kivutzotai resisei laila, which those of us who know Anim Zmiro might recognize also from there, right? Kivutzotai resisei laila. Anim Zmiro has a lot of Shir Ha-shirim among other references. This liturgical poem that many people recite on Shabbat morning and festival mornings. Um, Okay, so she says, I'm asleep. Not my husband, excuse me. I apologize for all the coughing that you're going to listen to today. Um, I had, I had a different thing on Zoom. I had parent-teacher conferences. They asked me if I wanted to cancel. I said, well, people can't get sick through Zoom, so um, I apologize and bear with me. But okay, so the male lover, right, is knocking at the door. Open up. Okay, and now it seems like either she says or she thinks, and I'm going to try and point out a few ambiguities. Pashatiti okutanti, I've taken off my cloak, echacha el bashanu, my robe. How can I put it back on again? Rachatzi et raglai, I already washed my feet before I got into bed. Echacha tefim. Now you want me to get them dirty again when I go to open the door? Meaning, oh, I mean, in a mundane way. I sleep on the couch a lot, as my mother can attest. And it's like sometimes when you're already kind of asleep, like you don't want to get up, and that's sort of what she's saying. Like I'm already in bed and I don't want to get up now. So either she says or she thinks that. It's kind of interesting. I always thought that she was saying that, but if you look at it, it's not clear that she's saying that. It could be she's thinking that, and he's just experiencing this waiting. Right. He's sort of outside knocking, and she neither says, I'm coming, nor I'm not here, nor go away. She's just sort of, she's having a whole internal deliberation, maybe. Uh, right. And now, but he reacts to that silence, or potentially, right. He reacts to whatever he's received, which probably is silence, in Pasuk Dalet. Dodi shalach yado min hachor, which we're going to have to talk about what that means. My beloved shalach yado. I'm going to translate hyper literally and not maybe so usefully. Shalach yado, he sent his hand, min hachor, from the hole. Ume'ai hamu alav, and then my my innards, my heart stirred for him. Right? My eyes, really my guts. Right? My stomach, it's almost like my stomach fluttered for him. Okay, so this is there. The translation here, which I think what most people want to say is, my beloved stuck his hand through some kind of hole that's next to the door. And then you have to think about like, well, I mean, later commentators are going to sort of say, oh, they must have had holes in their doors. Or maybe it's saying like is this a feature of a house that we're familiar with the door? Is it the keyhole? What does it mean to stick his hand through? Is he just passing it behind? We're going to see other possible interpretations of it also. Um, so she's kind of lying in bed being like, oh, I don't want to get up. Then somehow she catches another glimpse of him. Kamte ani liftoach lidodi. So I got up to open for him. V'yadai natfu more, and my hands are dripping with myrrh. Ve'etzbotai more over al kapon damanul. My fingers are flowing more on the handles of the bolt, meaning I'm unlocking. It seems like maybe she put on her makeup before she went, so she's like, all her hands are still covered in her beautiful perfume. She opens it up. Patachti ani lidodi. I open the door for my lover. V'dodi chamak avar. The here is probably a but, and it's an interesting question. Maybe in the first verse also, Ani yeshena vili be'er. I am asleep, but my heart is awake, right? So I opened the door, but my beloved had turned and gone, right? Nafshi yatsa b'debro. Now she's sort of speaking. She switches, it seems, almost immediately to some kind of nostalgia. Or maybe not. The way it's translated here is, Nafshi yatsa b'debro, my soul left me when he spoke or because of what he had said, bikashtiu v'lo metzatihu, meaning that I was still very affected by either what he had said here, what he had most recently said. So I started to seek him out, but I didn't find him. Kirati v'lo anani, I called to him, but he didn't answer me, which is the flip side when he called and she didn't answer, right? Um, and then so now she leaves the house looking for him. Her feet are getting dirty, obviously. Right, Mitzauni eshomarim asovavim ba'ir. So then the watchmen, we have a lot of characters in this story actually. The watchmen in the city found me, Hikuni Pitzauni, and they beat me up. Nasuit v'didi me'alai shomer chomot, right? And the guard patrollers took off my mantle, right? And I don't know if there's like an implication of sexual assault there or not, but it seems like scary, right? And then we kind of in the pshat level, right? The level where these are all supposed to be characters, it seems like there's a new frame because she says, Hishbahati etchem, I make you swear, daughters of Jerusalem, who are not the same people necessarily as the watchmen or the guards, right? In an allegorical reading, they may become collapsed into these are all the nations of the world. But in this reading, it seems somebody different, right? Um, Daughters of Jerusalem, im timtzu dima tekidulo. If you find my beloved, what should you tell him? Shecholat avani. Tell him that I am lovesick. So then the daughters of Jerusalem respond, Ma dodech midod hayafa banashim. Why is your lover so different, you beautiful woman? Ma dodech midod shekacha ishbatana. What's causing you to make us take this oath? And then she launches into this whole thing, which I only brought the first verse. Dodid tzachva adom dagul merivah, right? My beloved is clear-skinned and ruddy, and it's like many, many verses of sort of descriptions of the male lover and his beauty. Okay, so that's our story. I called this missed connection, um, because that's sort of the central drama of this story, right? There are many parts of Shir Ha-shirim where the lovers seem not to be together, where they're talking about each other and they're not together. But this is the place, and then there's places about where they're talking about how they want to be together, and in chapter 4 they want to be together and they actually get together, it seems, right? But in chapter 5, it seems like there the whole drama of this passage is about them not being together, not looking at the same time. I just thought it was actually, I don't know if people know the Italian movie Night of the Shooting Stars. Um, okay, whatever. So I watched it in high school with a good friend of mine, and there's this one extremely poignant scene where these two people who are divided by war are like they have to separate, and one looks back while the other is walking, and then the other person keeps walking, so they turn away, and then the other one looks back. And the point is, right, they both wanted to sort of share that last goodbye, but they don't because they look at the wrong times. And that's kind of what this is like, right? They both they're both interested in the other, but not at the right time. They're both seeking at the other one, but not at the right time, so they miss each other. Right. And because they miss each other, they don't actually, right, the chapter or the song ends with her description of him and why she loves him, but they don't actually get together at the end of this little sub story. Um, so that's kind of, I think, very evocative, source of a lot of drama, and can take you in a bunch of directions depending on how you want to understand Shir Ha-shirim. So I wanted to just bring a few of those. I think that in some ways, I guess I just want to recap something from last week and say something I didn't say. Last week I showed sort of, first of all, like the Rambam potentially Kabbalistic way of seeing Shir Ha-shirim as like a drama of love for God in general, maybe philosophically. And there's other people who see it this way, or about the soul and the body or other things. Tends to be, though not always, from maybe more likely from Sephardic authorities, right? There's a tradition in the midrash of sort of trying to look for historical events of the Jewish people, especially as reflected in Shir Ha-shirim, and we saw last time in Rashi, but you see it, I think, in many other Ashkenazi people, like readers, right? That first of all, these are events about the relationship of the Jewish people and God and the history, like sort of a historical allegory, but also that the events are not all positive. Even though these are love poems, actually a lot of the things referenced might be forms of suffering, or they might be addressed to people who are suffering, right? And that seems to be a particularly maybe, I have not read enough commentaries necessarily to say this, but based on what I was looking at, it seems like that is particularly maybe popular in medieval Ashkenaz, right? Or like in early post-Crusades Ashkenaz, right? Sort of like, this is the story of our continuing faithfulness despite the fact that we're suffering. And this story also, you could see, lends itself to that, because in the end she gets beaten and all she has to say is actually like, you don't understand how amazing my beloved is. So we'll see a little bit of that as well. But I wanted to show a few directions that you could go with this story, and then lean into one or two a little more heavily. So here's some guy, Rabbi Tanchu of Jerusalem, who this was okay, he lived in Jerusalem in the 13th century. Um, and this is actually an interesting thing. There's an Israeli scholar whose name I forget, or maybe didn't know, who translated this work, I think, from Judeo-Arabic and put it on Al HaTorah. For Al HaTorah, as if you know what that is, it's like it's a website that does a lot of both Tanakh and Shas commentary, but especially Tanakh, and they have a lot of like sort of like independent academic quality scholarly stuff that they post there, open source. So this is one of them. It's kind of interesting. So he says, I'm asleep, but my heart is awake. And he, to me, a little bit erases some of the back and forth drama of this story, right? I'm asleep, but my heart is awake, right? Amra Knesset Yisrael, imom nam hayinu yishenim. It's true. We were asleep. And it seems like he's talking about this as sort of like an imagined future or a past, a time of redemption, right? It's true. There was a time when we were asleep, when we were in Galut, right? But even so, even in Galut, our heart was still awake, meaning we still trusted God. Right, and we still thought about God. Again, this is a modern Hebrew translation of something. That word muda'ut is not a medieval Hebrew word. Awareness, right? Therefore, when we were still in a mode of lack of awareness, we still felt how we still sort of sensed the signs that were portending redemption. Um, right, and the signs were calling, prepare yourself. And this also, one of the things I want to get to is which we'll talk about in a second. Russell Soloveitchik also reads this passage very famously, but this is a precursor to that, right? The idea of sort of what this is about the children of Israel looking for the signs of redemption in their, or sort of anticipating or wanting to see the signs of redemption in their exilic existence, right? So get ready to meet me is what God is saying, and be happy when I'm going to come, right? When I knock on the door. Right, Roshinim Latal, when God said, my head is filled with dew, that means that the people are flooded with the abundance of lights of mercy. That God is flooded. I think that's probably Roshinim Latal, Hetzifu oti b'shefa orot harachamim. Ve'imeni oti, right? These, not the people, sorry. These lights sort of like moved me to act on account of these people who are suffering, right? In the dark night. Okay. Pashatati et kutanti. So this is the place where in the pshat of the story, I already took off my coat is kind of a little retreat. This is where the story gets interesting almost, where it's sort of like, oh, he arrived at the door, I opened the door, yay. That's not the story that happens. She thinks, oh, actually, I already took off my coat. And he has an interesting reading of it, which is, I took off my coat, Divrei Yisrael lefihem heim yachzeru lakel v'yasu tshuva ala chataim asher garmu lahem hagalut. Here, the cloak is actually the sins, and this is Israel saying, "Yes, I want to remove my sins." Right? It's not a retreat; it's part of sort of a linear process towards reunion or redemption. Okay, v'lo yachzeru lasot masim ka'ela. Right? Kasher hem chashvu al kach b'libam, and he doesn't understand. This is a thought that they're not necessarily expressing. But they're thinking, I took off my coat, meaning they're thinking, yeah, I'm going to leave behind my sins, and that's why they start to receive these sort of mercy or revelation from God. Right. Meaning that this phrase, which is her thought of I took off my coat, is not something she has to overcome to open the door. It's the thing that then like that makes me want to open the door because I'm giving up my sins and I'm going to open the door. So I thought that was interesting and also kind of I understand why one would want to read it that way. If you think of this as a story of Geula, you want it to be a story of redemption that's kind of linear, that God comes and then people are like, yeah, we want to be redeemed, we're ready, right? But it also doesn't 100% fit the drama or the internal rhythm of the original story. I think there's something a little bit missing. So that's why I just sort of put that there as like these stories can be, or these moments can be taken in many different directions. Sometimes maybe the sort of the nimshal, the thing you want it to mean, ends up influencing how you read the underlying story. right? If you want it to be about redemption and you think redemption is a linear process, maybe you end up reading it that way. And then the last paragraph, which I cut off, but he has like an extended thing about this. Maybe this is the first, he does understand that it's not a 100% linear happy ending. This is the return Shivat Zion after the first temple was destroyed because it doesn't fully get consummated, right? Because in the end, he's missing. She misses out on the husband, even though they're ready to come back. He's already gone, meaning they had to stop building the Beit HaMikdash, at least for a time. Although eventually then they get reunited. We'll see a different take of this as applied to Shivat Zion in the Second Temple and the building of the Second Temple that maybe is not right. Even there, the part the in the pshat of Shir Ha-shirim, in this sort of like the plot level, what's happening is that right they don't end up together at the end. Here that moment if she goes and she looks for him and he's not there, okay, but she's actually gonna we know the end of that story of the building of the second temple. It is gonna get built. Right? There are other even historical allegories that read it a little more maybe deeply as a thing that really doesn't happen. That really a connection that really is missed, not just missed for a few years. Okay. Another sort of move in this direction a little bit. That's kind of like a I would say underreading the hesitancy of the female and of the woman in the story, right? Above, we just said when she said I took off my coat, it's not that she's being lazy, she wants to sleep on the couch. It's that she's getting ready, she's removing her sins. This is another reading that kind of seems to give the benefit of the doubt to her. Again, from these medieval French, like it's sort of a commentary by Tosafists, I believe, where they say Pashat Gotanti, right? מתוך שהייתה ישנה, לא הייתה יודעת בבירור שזה דודה. Basically, she's asleep, she wakes up, she's like, oh, was that my lover? And like, as she's trying to figure out what's going on, that's when she says, Lekach nitrashla. Nitrashla is still a negative word. Reluctant is probably a soft translation of that. Therefore, she was negligent in opening the door. But right, we kind of understand, right? If she knew for sure that it was him, obviously she would have gotten up, right? Right? Leficha hayala torach, right? She didn't want to get her feet dirty. But then when she sees Dodi shalach yado min hachor, whatever that means, right? When she sees his hand, sheshalech yado min hachor lakitzeni mishnati, he sort of sent me additional information. He showed me his hand in some way. I understood that it was really him, and then I got out of bed. So these are two medieval readings that seem to kind of want to smooth over the woman's hesitancy in some way, either by reading as an allegory that I took off my coat is not actually a reason that I don't want to get out of bed, it's part of my preparation for getting out of bed, or that like she didn't recognize him immediately, she needed more information, and when she got it, she got up. Okay, I don't want to lean into that. I just wanted to, in the interest, first of all, of like showing how multifaceted all these interpretations or stories can be, but also in the interest of, I don't know, honesty, whatever it is. That like, you can take these things in multiple directions. That's one direction, a little bit more favorable to the woman, but we don't have to go there. I put this here first. I don't think that what I'm doing now is like, let's figure out how Rav Soloveitchik reads this story. But I want to put it Rav Soloveitchik is coming at the end of a long line of reading this story when he writes this passage called Dodido Fake, which I'll talk about more in a second. And one of the things I want to do is you could read this text called Dodido Fake directly as an interpretation of Shir Ha-shirim. And it's actually like, again, right, it comes largely out of this story of the woman who doesn't want to get up and then the lover goes away. You could read it that way, but I think it becomes richer the more you situate it in the history of interpretation of this passage, and a lot of things may become somewhat more clear about it. And then again, like Rav Soloveitchik is one of many interpretations. However, right, it's interpretatively interesting to see how he receives and both departs from, but also uses the existing interpretations. So I wanted to actually just show. This is here as a link. I don't know if you can see there if you got a PDF, but I wanted to briefly introduce Kol Dodi Fake. I'm not an expert in Rav Soloveitchik at all. Just putting that out there. It happens to be available in Sefaria in English translation. Very nice in Sefaria. So we could just see well, actually, before I do that, we can see the table of contents. the main idea that most people remember from Kol Dodido Fake, right, is the idea that this story of God knocking on the door is like God knocks on the his through history on the door of the Jewish people, and it's like a pro-Zionist essay where he says, right, God is knocking on our door now, telling us to either make Aliyah or support the state of Israel, right, to be Zionist in some way. Right, as opposed to our Soloveitchik, like, family that he grew up in, which was not Zionist. That's a big part of his thing, is to show like why ideologically, even though he's highly Orthodox, being Zionist is good. Okay, so that's the idea that most people remember from it, right? Like, it's God is knocking on the door, telling you, like, make a state of Israel. Okay, here is like the table of contents. And this is composed in 1956. There you go. Okay, the first thing is about the righteous suffer. Okay, then we have Job, who is a person who suffers, right? We miss the appointed knocks, all this stuff, right? Missing the appointed hour, there's 6 knocks. He goes through historical things that are happening in the 50s that he thinks are important. The obligation to the land of Israel, the different covenants, right? Different parts of being Jewish. Part of it is covenant of Sinai and of Egypt, being part of an ethnicity, but also being part of a Torah and mitzvot idea. Okay. I guess what I want to just point out is this beginning with suffering, which I think will also be a little bit explained. First of all, it's explained because this is 12 years after the Holocaust or less, right? But it's also explained because of the interpretive reception of this passage, I think. I'm not going to read this whole long thing that I put here. Um, I will confess that when source sheets get too long, it's usually because you're making them too late. But then you have more to read at home if you want. So here I'm going to read I'm going to skim mostly on the parts that I underlined, right? So he's talked about how you shouldn't miss the time, right? When a miracle doesn't find its appropriate, and he talks about what happens with, right, the events of history and suffering. This is also very sort of classic Brisker, I guess, right? Suffering is supposed to spur you to ask, how am I supposed to respond, as opposed to asking, why did this happen? So when a miracle doesn't find its appropriate echo in actual deeds, meaning things happen in the world and you're supposed to do something about them, a lofty vision dissipates and is squandered. That moment is kind of lost. And divine justice indicts the ungrateful recipient of the miracle. Right? We have people who were supposed to be the Messiah and weren't. Nice grammar, but we'll skip it. Suffering is the final warning given by providence to the man, right? Then people who don't respond to some positive thing end up instead getting a different kind of reminder, which is suffering, which we haven't seen in our story at all. Well, actually, the suffering is inflicted by the guards, right? So it's an interesting question how that relates to here. That will come up in the other midrashim. To the final proclamation that issues forth from suffering, one must react quickly and answer the call of the Almighty, who says, "Where are you?" Judaism has been very careful about not missing the appointed hour, and he gives a bunch of halachic sources. You lose the ability to perform certain mitzvot if you wait even for a little bit. And then he has this nice, I'm not going to give the whole example, but it's very dramatically illustrated. 2 kids of Israel, both equally anointed, sinned, repented fully, and confessed. That's Saul and David, right? Because that people love to tell the story of David's redemption, or David he does this terrible thing. He sleeps with a married woman. He gets her husband killed. Like, it's really bad. He's sort of like hit 2 of the 3 big sins as we know of them. And then somehow he just says, "Oh yeah, I sinned," and that's enough for him to remain king, where King Saul also sinned, and somehow that's enough for him to lose his kingship. So the Rav is saying, well, the difference is David immediately says, "I sinned," once he figures out what he's being called out for. Whereas when Prophet Samuel tells King Saul, "You did X wrong," right? You didn't kill Amalek, but it doesn't actually really matter for the point of this reading. You did X wrong. Saul's first reaction is, "No, I didn't. Actually, I did it right." Or what I did, I have a reason for what I did. It's justified in some way. And even though within a few verses he says, "You know what, you're right, I sinned," that delay is too much. It's almost like it's an interesting it's saying something about what the moment really means. You have to meet the moment. The moment could be like it's actually in some ways very true to the original story where, right, she's sort of she's figuring it out in her head. She's figuring out, is this really my lover? Right? And as she's figuring it out, that's too long. right? It's like Saul is working through a process. He has this initial denial, but he gets to it. But that getting to it is not enough. You have to have sort of an instinct that brings you there immediately, seems to be the claim. Right. So now he's going to say that's what the Song of Song is, which is fun. It's an interesting claim about all the Song of Songs. It's definitely true of our story. What is Shir Ha-shirim if not the description of a paradoxical and tragic hesitation on the part of the love-intoxicated, anxiety-stricken lover when the opportunity in awe presented itself? Right? The great moment for which she had been waiting with such longing came at a time of inattentiveness, right? She's like, oh, I'm already asleep. And the idea is being asleep. Maybe you shouldn't have been asleep. So there's like a long thing about, right? He sort of uses a lot of very dramatic language to bring out that moment. The opportunity was lost, the vision of exalted life died. True, after a brief delay, she awoke from her slumber, right? But the leap came too late, right? That that little hesitation was enough to destroy the entire encounter. Anyway, and then she sort of her existence became a desert, right? She's in this feverish search. She, the lover, still wanders, seeking her beloved because of that one moment of hesitation. So that's a sort of a dramatic reading, which he believes has political ramifications. But I wanted to read, like I said, right? I'm interested in that as a reading of this passage and where it might come from. So I have a selection of sources here, um, some of which will be more directly related to that than others, but all of which hopefully will have something to say about our little story. So here's Shir Ha-shirim, like the passage we saw from, sorry, Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah, like the passage we saw from it last time. It's just kind of like a huge dump of like all sorts of interpretations of the same verse. So Ani Yeshena, I am asleep, right? I'm asleep, but my heart is awake, right? So we're gonna have a bunch of, and that's again, right? There's all sorts of things that are like these nice little pairs, and you can just come up with like a million pairs that go with that. Who's asleep and who's awake? What does it mean to be asleep? What does it mean to be awake? So, for example, the congregation of Israel said, I am asleep regarding the mitzvot, but my heart is awake for acts of kindness, right? Meaning, yeah, maybe we're not so good at ritual, but we're still good people. Or I am asleep from tzedakah, right? V'libi er la sotan, but my heart is awake, meaning I'm not actually doing it, but I want to do it. That's maybe more in the right, the original. I'm asleep about korbanot, but my heart is awake for prayers, right? That like there are things that we're doing and things that we're not doing, and isn't that kind of enough? Which is maybe an interesting way of looking. And I don't know if isn't that kind of enough, but that like we're not totally gone. It makes kind of sense that this would be a moment where God would approach us because we're doing some of the things. Um, right, I'm asleep in the temple, but my heart is awake in synagogues and study halls. Right. I'm asleep regarding the end of days, but my heart is awake for redemption. What does that mean? Ani yeshena min haketz really be air. Yeshena there means maybe I'm not aware. I don't know exactly when the end of days is going to be, but I'm ready for it. Ani yeshena min hageula v'libo, and then there's a switch in which you can't even necessarily see. You wouldn't. The passage doesn't mark it for you so strongly, but it's there, right? These are at the beginning. It's all things that like Israel is kind of like part way there. Either there's something that they're either not doing or they don't know, but they're kind of still in the game in some way. Now we're going to have a switch. Ani yeshena min hagula. I am asleep about redemption, meaning it could be I've given up on it or something. Really bo shalakadosh baruch hu er legoleni, but God's heart is awake to redeem me. Right there, libi, where she says my heart is being interpreted as God's heart, which is a little bit of a switcheroo, right? But then what's actually really happening is "Mechan matzinu shnikra kadosh baruch hu liban shel Yisrael," when the woman says, "My heart, the heart of Israel is really God." So that's again, right? First of all, just like genre-wise, here we have a whole bunch of different interpretations of this one little couplet, not necessarily trying 100% there's not like a one of them carries through as a metaphor for the entire story. And this idea of ani yeshena v'libi er fundamentally can be seen in two ways. One is it's capturing the tension of the woman throughout the story, which is she wants to be responsive, but maybe not 100%, right? She's kind of in it, kind of not, which is going to play out temporally later. Or if you say libi er is God, then it's really putting her down more. It's saying actually like she's asleep this whole time. She misses the boat. It's only because God is after her that anything happens at all. going on to the next verse. It says, right, Bashati, I took off my coat, right? Before we saw somebody who says, oh, this is actually positive. She's taking off her sins. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says, everybody knows how to dress and undress. So what does it mean? She says, I took off my coat. Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Yochanan says, on the day the wicked Nebuchadnezzar attacked Israel, he removed them from them two great garments, the garments of priesthood and the garments of royalty. And she says, I washed my feet. But then she says, I washed my feet from idol worship. Nevertheless, my beloved extended his hand through the hole. Okay, so this is kind of interesting because here, right, in the allegorical reading, when she says, I've taken off my cloak, it's not that I'm not motivated, it's that I'm lacking the tools that I would have once had to meet you, right? Like God is knocking at the door, but the institutions that would have previously been identified as the way to connect with God are now absent, right? Because we don't have the priests and we don't have the kingdom. So what are we going to do? And then so that's sort of one piece. Again, a little bit like reading, it's not just her being lazy, it's her trying to adapt to a new situation, which is going to come up again, and maybe something that I'm going to want to revisit in a minute. Here's the last thing also. I think that, again, right, with each of these things, they're saying something about the way the rabbis are seeing Jewish history, but they're also saying something about the story. So Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said, why is the image of a hole employed here, right? It's reading very carefully. Let's say he stuck his hand in the hole. That's how this midrash is reading it. What's the hole? It's not the door, it's not the window, because those have words. That's the way the midrash understands it, right? The hole is not the window. So why would you stick your hand in a hole? Hole usually is a place where there's like, going to be like cockroaches or gross stuff, right? So why are you sticking your hand in a hole? That's actually part of the metaphor. Part of the metaphor is that God is appearing through a kind of gross thing. And what's gross about it? Because he's appearing through this non-Jewish king, Daryavesh, Koresh, and not through like a nice Jew like Daniel. Um, or not directly through a nice Jew like Daniel. Okay, so it's basically saying, right, that the medium of redemption, sort of the beginning of of Shivat Zion again, of the return from the Persian exile, is the medium might not be as ideal as one would hope, and they're still supposed to, Me'ai Hamuel, they're still supposed to react to it as like, okay, this is not exactly how I imagined it, but it's better. Like it's still my beloved at the door. Um, and that again has resonances maybe for Rav Soloveitchik, but it's interesting to see even here, right, that part of in the story, right, this reading of it as an allegory causes you to see something back in the plot of the story, which is maybe there's something in the story about her having to come to terms with encountering her lover in non-ideal circumstances. Meaning maybe, my I don't want to get my feet dirty might, for example, might not just be like I'm being lazy, but like I don't dirty feet are gross, right? Like, do we really have to have dirty feet when we meet each other? And the answer in the end is kind of yes, that would actually be okay. That's not a big deal. That's a small deal. Um, that's what I want to take from the Midrash. Last time we saw how Rashi tries to take ideas that he's seen in the Midrash and kind of like tell them as a sequence of events. So here we have several Rashis, which I'll talk about. The first is this, and this we have not seen. Dabri shalach yado min hachor. I said it's kind of ambiguous. We'll see a few interpretations. Mostly what we've seen is he stuck his hand through the hole. That's how most people, I think, want to interpret it. I want to talk about why Rashi does something different. Shalach yado beher'an nikmato bimei achaz. He sent his hand, meaning he demonstrated his vengeance in the days of Achaz, meaning Achaz, king of Judah or Israel, right? And he brought vengeance from Aram. That like God is sort of enacting bad things on Israel. So why would Shalach Yado mean that? Okay, this is I found kind of I had not thought of this as an interpretation until I saw it in these people, but that's actually what Shalach Yado means in a lot of places, right? We just had it on Purim. Asher bikshu lishloch yad b'melech Achashverosh, right? The people who plotted to assassinate King Achashverosh tried to lishloch yad, right? That like lishloach yad be somebody, right? Don't lishloach yad be'ex means don't harm them, right? I believe it comes up with Eitz Hadat. God says don't lishloach yad bo, right? Or he certainly says I don't remember about that actually. I don't know Rabbi Silver has a whole piece of Torah about that, but I might be misremembering the exact words, right? Avraham, Avraham, al tishlach yadcha al hanar, right? Don't send your hand against the boy, right? Shloach yad with a direct object can mean to harm. So even though here there is no direct object, you're not shalach yado elai, right? Min hachor. He set his hand against me through the hole, but that seems to be what's behind this reading, which also appears in the midrash, but which in a few places which I didn't show you, but Rashi's picking it up, right? And Rashi's picking it up because maybe he thinks that's what the phrase actually means, because shalach yado can mean to harm, right? But that also changes the story, right? Where the story, instead of, right, the lover knocks, she kind of delays. He sticks his hand in to be like, no, really open the door. The second thing the lover does, the first thing he does is knock and say open up. The second thing he does is say is sort of something hurtful, which the Rav said, right? If you miss the first miraculous thing, the second thing is going to be suffering, which is supposed to be your last ditch warning. Um, Again, like I don't know that I'm like I don't know how I feel about this theology, but it's there, right? And that's part of, I'm sure, right, the Rav knows Rashi, and again, it's not only just Rashi, but that's part of where it's coming from, right? That the story itself can be a little darker than that, where actually like the turn of the male lover is not only when he goes away, but even before then, he's become a little more hurtful. May I hamu alav. Right now, he's going to read this as a fully like series of historical events. Right, my inners long for him. This is Chizkiyahu, the son of Achaz, right, who came and repented. Right, so first I didn't get up. That's the bad king. Then God punished us, right, and like the enemies came and conquered us. Then Chizkiyahu came and he tried to repent. Okay. Then, right, I opened for my beloved, but he vanished, which means even though Chizkiyahu did tshuva and caused all the people to be good, it wasn't enough to forestall the destruction. Some of these people, right, my beloved had vanished and gone. He didn't annul his decree, right? He's all these people, these sort of good Jews are going to be taken to, they're going to be like taken to Babel, right? I'm bringing calamity upon you, etc. Okay. My soul departed me as he spoke. I don't have it here, but I'll say something else about that in a minute. But here it's like, wow, I was really disheartened when I learned that it wasn't going to be enough to forestall destruction. I sought him, but I couldn't find him. Now, what does that mean, right? You should ask, wasn't Yirmiyahu prophesying? Yirmiyahu said, right, return to me, I'll return to you. The answer is, so how does that mean I could not find him? Weren't they promised that you would be able to find him if you really sought him? And the answer is, you're not going to be able to forestall the redemption again, right? The watchman found me. Who's the watchman, right? The Nebuchadnezzar, right? Sort of like the non-Jewish authorities who are the agents of God in this sense. And they stripped my ornament, being the Beit HaMikdash. So again, it's like sort of a series of historical events through the destruction of Beit Sheni. Like we saw somebody above want to apply it to the Shivat Zion, but in any this is like the Rashi Shita of sort of like the psukim go in order of stuff that happens, right? And the story ends with the end of right with Galut, and with, if we know Jewish history, the possibility of return, because there is going to be return to the second Beit HaMikdash. Here's Mitzudat David, more of a pshat-oriented commentary on this same story. I've taken off my coat. So with each of them, he kind of explains. I took out some of them just so it would be a little shorter. But with each pasuk, he kind of explains like, what does this mean in the plot level? And then what does it mean in the allegory level? So here, I took off my coat. He explains kind of how we understood it. How I think this is like most people understand it, right? I don't want to get up. I already got undressed. I'm wearing my pajamas. Okay. The allegory meaning is to say I'd grown lazy about going up to Jerusalem if I already settled in Bavel, right? That here the knock is not before they're being exiled, hey, do tshuva. The knock is you've already been exiled, but I want to bring you back. Which again, this is a precursor to what the Rav is saying of, oh, that's what's happening now, is that God is knocking, saying, come back to Israel. Maybe not literally come back to Israel, but do be involved with Israel in some way. But here he's saying that that's what happened, right? That like the people didn't want to leave Bavel. So my beloved put his hand through the hole, right? The intention being that she would see his hand and long for him and feel distress at his parting from her. Right? It's not, and again, right, this is another potential layer to the original story that also now has an allegorical meaning. It's not that this is his second attempt to get her to open. He already knows he's leaving because she's not going to make it to the door in time. This is just his way of saying bye on the way out, making sure she knows that it was him and that she missed the opportunity. Right? I was in pain. Right? Allegorical meaning is to say that the Holy One sent his word through Chagai, Zachari, and Malachi. Right? And this is really interesting, right? Because Chagai, Zachari, and Malachi are the last prophets. And what he's saying is, right, that's God's last message. And God knows when he sends it that it's going to be the last message. And that afterwards, it's going to cause the people to miss it in some way. Even though, right, the story is sort of, well, we'll see. The story here, the allegory is happening on two levels. There's one, right, in terms of the connection between God and Israel, right? There's one level of connection, which is prophecy, which God is knocking, they're slow to respond. God gives this last hurrah of prophecy, the hand through the door, and then it's going to disappear. The connection is going to eventually happen, as we're going to see. I arose, the allegorical meaning is to say, and engage in the building, right? Even though, right, like the story then goes on with the Jewish people doing a thing, which is building the second temple. Um, right? And then I sought out God and I searched for him, but I couldn't find him. Right? So here, right, the allegorical meaning is to say, when I completed the building of the temple, prophecy was withdrawn. I was greatly pained by its absence. I went about seeking to restore it, but I was unable to achieve it. What I think is so interesting about this allegorical reading is that right, there's the plot of this little vignette ends with them not connected, right? And whereas the prior readings have seen that as, well, that must mean it ends in galut, right? It ends in exile, right? So like this is a story about how they failed to respond to God and end up in exile. Here the story is they end in Bayit Sheni, right? Or even in the first thing we saw, how they end, it's not that they end in exile, but that the end of this story is when they got interrupted building Bayit Sheni. But here, the story ends with Bayit Sheni, which everyone else see, all the other allegorical or the other allegorical readings that we saw I would imagine, take that as a win, right? That's the thing they want that they might not get because of where the story ends. Here, that's the thing they thought they want, but it's not the only thing they want. And the story still ends on a note of lack of connection because they've lost the capacity for prophecy, which I think is really potentially suggestive for us, I guess, as modern readers, in terms of we know that like the mode of connecting to God changes over time, let's say, right? What if you take that same story and tell it 400 or 500 years later, where the story is, well, it's not exactly the same, but sort of, right, we rebuilt institutions of Jewish life, but we lost the thing that we had previously thought was a connection, right? You can't really go home again, right? We rebuilt the second temple, but we don't have prophecy, right? We made synagogues, but we don't have korbanot. It's not 100% analogous, but there seems to be a potential parallel reading there. And what struck me about this was that way of sort of thinking about historical contingency and flexibility and change, as here it's being portrayed kind of as a source of loss, but we also know that it's a source of, I mean, like they do have the temple right here, that can be its own source of next steps, right? Like the relationship with God, let's say, is continuing even if they don't have prophecy. It just looks different than they expected. Um, and maybe that's part of, again, in the background of the Rev, right? Well, I don't know if I'm going to have time to say this. I'll say something very quickly in a minute, right? Where people thought that what these narrative passages in Shir Ha-shirim were about a particular relationship to Galut, and he's arguing it's about the opposite relationship to Galut. This is maybe a little bit of a precursor of like, you don't actually know, right? Like the thing that you thought was the anchor of your relationship might change. That's one thought. I alluded to this earlier. The most recent two JPS translations have my beloved took his hand off the latch. Shalach Yedo. So that's the third interpretation we've seen for Shalach Yedo. One is he put his hand through, one is he harmed me, and one is he took his hand off the latch, so it has little like bees, like meaning of Hebrew uncertain or whatever. But that's another possibility, which again is like a form of detachment, right? That it's part of the process of disconnection that then she has to sort of make sense out of. Right, and the Rokeach has this other idea, a similar sort of historical allegory of, right, like I opened for my beloved, but then he left me, in parentheses, because of my sin of the golden calf, for example, and then he talks about Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. I'm going to finish with just this 5 minute thought. Um, our story in chapter 5 on the first page, which said at the end, she says, Hishpati etchem benot Yerushalayim, I make you swear, daughters of Jerusalem. That phrase, Hishpati etchem benot Yerushalayim, appears 4 times in Shir Ha-shirim. 3 of them are extremely similar. One could talk a lot more about them. I don't think I plan to, so I'm just going to put them here for the last 4 minutes. So, for example, in Parak Bet, right, his right hand embraced me. His left hand was under my head. His right arm embraced me. Yishpati etchem benot Yerushalayim, right? I adjure you, maidens of Jerusalem, by gazelles or by the hinds of the field, which is also a source of interpretation that maybe I won't mention. Im ta'iru v'im toru et havat shetichpatz, right? So this is interesting. If you wake up or, rouse the love until it pleases, seemingly don't do that. Don't wake up either the love or my beloved until it wants to. And similarly, with the other two, oh, I put the wrong things here, but that's okay. There's another one that's in chapter 3. No, that's right here. Mishkavila balilot, a similar story to ours, but a little different, right? Upon my couch, you could call it, at night, I sought the one I love. I sought him, but found him not, right? I got up, I looked around for him, right? I sought him. I met the watchman who patrolled the town. Have you seen my beloved? So it has echoes of our story, but it's a little different. Scarcely had I passed him when I found him. I held him fast. I wouldn't let him go. I adjure you, maidens of Jerusalem, do not rouse the love until it pleases, and a third time, do not rouse the love. So this is the source of the famous 3 O's that like motivates a lot of like Satmar anti-Zionism. Okay, here's a version of it that says there are 4 oaths. There's many, many different versions of it. I just picked one. He administered an oath to Israel that they would not rebel against the kingdoms, they would not accelerate the end of days, and would not reveal their secrets to the nation. Right? Um, 4 oaths corresponding to 4 generations that sought to accelerate the end and didn't. Um, anyway, and there maybe is a parallel oath that the nations are not supposed to oppress them. I don't know if people are familiar with this idea or not, but I guess the reason I wanted to just put this in conversation with the first one is I think it's also there's a whole tradition of interpreting these oaths as basically being about the mandate for Jews to suffer in Galut, right? Um, Either a mandate or just the fact of suffering in Galut, depending on which text you're reading and how you read it. But that too is in conversation with our story, where in the end she gets beat up by the night watchman and she maybe doesn't find him, right? And that's also part of the background when Rav Soloveitchik is reading Hishpati Etchem Benot, right? When Rav Soloveitchik is reading our story in chapter 5, he's also very aware that this is the same word, right? That this word Hishpati Etchem has in contemporary discourse around Zionism one meaning, right? By Satmar Rebbe, let's say, but it's not. It goes back to the Gemara, right, about these oaths that the Jews take, and he's saying there's another oath, right? The other oath is like you don't want to be in the position of telling people about the thing that you missed, and that's kind of how, like, I tend to think that locating that polemic in Shir Ha-shirim is an indirect response to the existence of these 3 O's. So that's kind of I don't know if that's the last word. Like I said, I'm not here like being like we're going to understand the story like Rav Soloveitchik understood it. But if I want to go back and see what we did, we have a story that is very rich in its own terms, in terms of the plot of like the drama between the husband and the lover, the 2 lovers, right? There's a lot of ambiguity within it itself, right? What is he doing? Is he punishing her? Is he taunting her and waving goodbye? Is he trying to connect to her more? What is she doing? Is she just confused? Is she lazy? Is she actually trying her best and saying how all the good things she's done, right? There's multiple different ways of understanding the story and its analogy. And there's different ways of thinking about where and when it applies, right? Does it apply to a time in Jewish history of disconnection that was then rectified with the Second Temple? Does it apply to the Second Temple period itself, but that period is lacking prophecy? Does it apply to any future period where we're always trying to connect and we fail, right? The destruction of the Second Temple, for example. Those are all kind of out there and in the readings of this possible passage. Even before Rav Soloveitchik gets to it, he has a particular reading for it, very much a product of 1956, let's say, but also very much a product of all these things that came before. And that's kind of what I wanted to see. So I really appreciate you being here, and I wish you an excellent evening.
Thank you everyone for making time tonight, and we will
Yeah.
meet one last time next week for the final part of this three-part series.
Thank you for bearing with me.
Take care, everyone.